Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on Jewish values and civic engagement. I am Corey Shapiro, JCPA board member and co-chair of the Policy Advisory Committee, and I'm here from Louisville, Kentucky. I want to welcome everyone for attending this webinar, and thank you for attending this webinar. JCPA is the national network hub of 125 community relations councils and 16 national Jewish agencies. JCPA convenes a network together to grapple with pressing issues of the day, build consensus policy, and then carry it out with other racial, ethnic, and faith influential leaders to build a just and pluralistic society. This civic engagement is a core Jewish American value, religious and civic. Yet, just as the COVID-19 pandemic has altered almost every aspect of the way we live and work, inevitably it will also impact how we vote this November. This webinar will focus on the efforts different Jewish religious denominations are taking to promote a strong democracy and election participation during COVID-19. We are so pleased to have with us several prominent speakers today who represent pillars of our network. One of JCPA's unique value propositions is that we represent the four denominations of religious Judaism who come together as part of our network on major issues to ensure a just and pluralistic American society. The format of this program today is that we will hear presentations from each of our speakers, and then we will come back together for an interactive panel discussion and Q&A. If you want to ask a question, please put your question in the question box on your screen, and we will get to that question later in the program. I would like to introduce our first speaker, Rabbi Pessner, who serves as the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. He has led the Religious Action Center since 2015. Rabbi Pessner also serves as senior vice president of the Union for Reform Judaism, a position to which he was appointed to in 2011. Rabbi Pessner, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Corey Shapiro, and all of our friends at JCPA. It's really just such an honor to be with you today. And we are proudly one of the national organizations that is part of JCPA, the Union for Reform Judaism, which is the largest and most diverse denomination in Jewish life and a partner of JCPA and the other esteemed religious denominations and their rabbis who are on this call. Thank you to Melanie Roth Gorlick and Chaya Luftig as well from JCPA for everything that you've done. And I must say, I begin this presentation with utter humility, being in the presence of Rabbis Konigsburg, Hauer, and Waxman. You are three incredible teachers of the Jewish tradition and leaders in the public square. And so I'm really honored to be with you. I want to frame the conversation about civic engagement as a Jewish value, uniquely as the leader of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, which was in many ways born out of the American Jewish experience and the Jewish commitment to civics. And in a moment, I'll share a little bit of Jewish textual frame, the 5,000-year-old why we engage in civic engagement. But I want to start with the narrative why, the origin story of the Religious Action Center, which may resonate across all denominational boundaries for sure, and even across faith lines. The RAC, as we call it, the RAC, was born out of the civil rights struggle. Our founder was Kivi Kaplan, who was a great Jewish philanthropist, and like many of his generation, was the descendant of immigrants who came to this country with nothing. He made himself successful as a business person, and like so many American Jews, became very active as a philanthropist. But the defining experience of his life was when he and his new wife, Emily Kaplan, were on their honeymoon in Florida. They were being driven around by a black taxi driver. And everywhere they went, they kept seeing signs that would say, "No Jews, no dogs." This was Kaplan's direct experience of anti-Semitism in this way for the first time in his life. And he turned to the black taxi driver and asked what this was and if it was common in the Jim Crow South. Kivi was from the North. The black taxi driver looked at Kivi and famously said, "They don't even bother with us." Kivi Kaplan understood at that moment the truth of Dr. King's teaching that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and that our safety as Jews, as a minority, comes in our solidarity with other groups. He became very active in the NAACP, which people may forget was an organization founded by white Jews and black Christians. And he was the last white Jewish president of the NAACP. When he stepped down in the 70s, he was determined that the NAACP would be led by a person of color. And he bought an embassy-sized building in Washington, D.C., and gave it to the Reform Jewish movement to be the hub of civil rights activity. And we accepted his donation, but he had one caveat, which is that the RAC would be the host to the luminaries of the civil rights era, which is why Dr. King, when he would come to Washington, would use our Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism as his office, a little known fact of Jewish history in America. And the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights was housed in our building so that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was written in our conference room. So when people ask why the movement that I'm part of is so engaged in civics and in democracy and in voting rights, that's our legacy. We've been at it in this formal way for 6 decades, and it's core to who we are. And it gets back to that initial vision of Kivi Kaplan, who understood that in an experience of anti-Semitism, here in America, our safety is in our solidarity, and the possibility of redemption happens through our democracy. The Voting Rights Act, which is the single most important piece of legislation for democracy preservation in American history, which, as people know, Congressman John Lewis, his memory for a blessing, had his head bashed in on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, marching along with Jewish luminaries like Heschel and the first director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, Rabbi Dick Hirsch. Of course, I invoke the names of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, who also gave their lives for voting rights. So it feels like it's not just that it's a Jewish value, but it's a bit of American Jewish heritage and legacy to be part of the fight for civil rights and social justice. From a textual perspective, the 2020 version of our voting rights work and the reform movement is called Kol Kolot, which is a wonderful play on Hebrew. So stay with me for a moment. Kol is a pun because in Hebrew, kol can either be spelled kaf lamed or kuf lamed. Kaf lamed means all or every, but kol, which is kuf vav lamed, can mean voice, like the bat kol, the heavenly voice that cries out, the kol of the shofar, the sound of the shofar. Kol can also be the sound of lightning, but it also is often used to mean vote. So our campaign is called Kol Kolot because it means both every voice and every vote. And if you visit our website, if you go to rac.org and you click on the Civic Engagement button, you'll see a range of Jewish textual sources, both from the biblical text through the rabbinic texts, and some of my rabbinic colleagues this afternoon are going to share teachings that are literally some of the same text that you can see online. And if we'll send you afterwards links so that you can see for yourself. But the biblical text, there's quite a transformation from Deuteronomy through Samuel into 1 Kings about the way in which God and the children of Israel relate around appointing a leader, appointing a king, as the Israelites increasingly become more concerned with how a king and how a ruler is actually selected and appointed, not just anointed by God. And this culminates in rabbinic literature, and Rabbi Konigsburg is going to teach actually what the rabbis had to say about how a leader is chosen and the role of people in weighing in with consent. The last thing that I want to just share before I turn it over to the rest of my distinguished panel are 2 reflections. One is around the Jewish values around voting and a reflection on that, and then tactically, just the 3 pillars of the campaign. I have to invoke the name of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who we mourn for. We're still in the period of mourning, even though Yom Kippur technically ended the mourning, our hearts are still mourning. She was uniquely an American Jewish woman who also, like Kivi Kaplan, her experience of anti-Semitism led to her advocating for the rights of all people. One of her most withering dissents was in Shelby v. Holder, which was a voting rights ruling, and I urge people to read offline what she wrote. But I lift it up now because not the logic of her dissent, but what she said about dissent. She talked about dissent as being what would be a beacon for future generations of that which is possible. Because obviously, if you're writing in the dissent, you've lost the argument, but it telegraphs for the future what's possible. That wisdom of Ruth Bader Ginsburg is deeply Talmudic, because remember that it's in the tradition of the Talmud that the minority opinion is always published. And the rabbis were very clear about this. The reason why Hillel was elevated over Shammai was because Hillel consistently amplified the dissenting view of Shammai before making their own argument. That is to say, reasonable people in a democracy can disagree. And in this moment of utter polarization, when people with labels, whether it's Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative or what have you, are allowing the sacredness and the sanctity of dialogue and dissent be lost, it is a deeply Jewish value to debate, to discuss, to disagree, and then to honor and love the person with whom we have disagreed. And our work around civic engagement is every voice, every vote, because it doesn't matter what party you affiliate with or what person you vote for. It matters that your voice is heard with clarity and it's respected by the other side. So if you visit the RAC website, you'll see the 3 pillars to the strategy. One is 100% voting communities, making sure that every synagogue in American Jewish life has every member, every part of their synagogue family knows how to vote and exercises their right to vote, making sure that democracy is protected and that various forms of voter suppression are turned back, and a highlight and emphasis on student engagement. One of the things I'm most proud of is not only that we've seen an uptick, significant uptick in first-time voters by 18 to 30-year-olds, driven in part by Jewish students, but also Jewish students who are stepping up young people to work the polls because of COVID and the risk to people who, particularly seniors who have classically worked at the polls. We're seeing an enormous number of idealistic Jewish young people who are volunteering to work at the polls. So my prayer and hope for this election is kol kolot, whoever you support, whatever party you affiliate with, every voice, every vote should be respected and should be heard. Thank you again to JCPA and to my distinguished rabbinic colleagues.
Thank you, Rabbi Pessner. I would like to introduce our next guest, Rabbi Waxman, who became president of Reconstructing Judaism in 2014 and is the first woman rabbi to head a Jewish congregational union and a Jewish seminary. Since then, she has drawn on her training as a rabbi and historian to be the Reconstructionist movement's leading voice in the public square. Rabbi Waxman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Corey, and I want to echo Rabbi Pessner's appreciation to you and to Melanie and to Haya and everyone at JCPA for organizing this, and the esteem that I feel to be serving on this panel with my beloved colleagues. I'm going to begin with the text and then unpack it. And the text I brought is from I want to just focus in on the Torah portion, Nitzavim, which is right at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. We read it in early September. It is a short and a very compelling portion. It's possibly my favorite. Its placement at the end of Deuteronomy, which is the repetition, a recitation, a second telling of everything that came before, raises it up as a really important text. And this parsha begins with a comprehensive description of community. So it begins, Atem mitzavim hayom kulchem lifnei Adonai. You stand this day, all of you, before the Lord your God. And it goes on and lists whole categories of people. I'll just switch to the English for the sake of time. The captains of your tribes, your elders and your officers with all of the people of Israel. It goes on and says, and your tapchem, your little ones, your wives, the stranger in your camps, from the hewer of the wood to the drawer of the water, so that all of you may enter into a covenant. So that's at the beginning, this incredible call for comprehensive community, including people who are not usually named in the Torah, the women and the children, and they think that those occupations that are listed are there because they are among the lowest in the hierarchy of workers. And the covenant is about mutuality, about relationship, about obligation. And we know from everything that's preceded that this brit is between God, between the people of Israel and God, and also it's behavioral, it's between each other. The Parsha goes on in the next chapter and talks about what it means to live out this covenant. And it says in verse chapter 30, verse 11, for this commandment, this commandment I command to you today, lo nifleti mimcha the lo rechoka he. It's lo bashamayim he. It is not hidden from you. It's not far off. It is not in heaven. It is right here. You have to act to bring it to life. And the parsha ends with making this even more explicit, because this is the portion that says, I set before you a blessing and a curse. Choose the blessing, choose life so that you and your descendants may live. So this is, these powerful echoes of the Yamim Noraim and our role in choosing to write ourselves into the book of life. So why do I raise up this text? Because I believe it maps powerfully onto a Jewish perspective on democracy. This comprehensive community, even the listing of people who are not honorably listed, echoes exactly what Rabbi Pessner just said, that kol kolot, kol ish visha, kol anashim, every single person, every individual matters. And the call to action, lo bashamayim hi, that not only does each and every individual matter, but that we have the possibility, the promise of raising our voice through our vote and through civic action, and that we can enact and choose blessings, that we can take this action, we can step up and do what is necessary to create the life that we want for ourselves and for our descendants. And in this season, Tishrei for sure, all of our Jewish holidays, but also as we enter into the election season, it means participating in, I was thinking about the census as one of our constitutionally mandated civic duties, and also in the electoral process. So the ancient rabbis taught the process of midrash, that we turn a text so that we can make meaning of it for our time. And this strategy that I just used of bringing a traditional Jewish text and of mapping it out alongside civic value like democratic commitments is this strategy of recognizing the consonance between Jewish practice and Jewish flourishing and democratic principles is a long-standing among American Jews of all types. Because I think from many of us, from our forebears who immigrated to those of us who were born here, the promise of the founding documents of American society and the implications of what that meant for the lives and the aspirations of all of our citizens have just been incredibly inspiring. Added to the fact of no established religion. So the space for Jews and other minorities, especially religious minorities, to flourish, to bring our lives to fullness. And so when the folks at JCPA asked us to bring texts, I debated whether or not to bring Judah David Eisenstein's translation of the U.S. Constitution. He did that into Hebrew and into Yiddish in 1891 to bring the Constitution as a Jewish text. You see, I made a different choice, but I spent a lot of time looking at classical Reconstructionist texts talking about the importance of democracy. Reconstructionism was established here on American soil in the 1920s and deeply, deeply draws on democratic commitments and on the promise of those founding documents. And I'll just raise up a couple of the things that really resonated in the 30s and the 40s to this day, because I think they speak to our Jewish community and to our larger environment. One is that Reconstructionists put forward the idea of unity in diversity across the Jewish community. It was entirely drawn from the American emblem of E pluribus unum. And so there was definitely this understanding that we should, across our differences, find a sense of whatever unites us. The idea of Jewish peoplehood was very much a Reconstructionist offering, and that understanding that we could also find that on the American level, that there were ways for us to be united with the rest of the American environment while also preserving our distinctiveness. So where the classical Reconstructionists helped to legitimate the idea of especially religious pluralism in the Jewish community by putting forward concepts like civilization and peoplehood in the 30s and the 40s, at this time when we see that the pluralism exists, but there's almost like a balkanization, there's a separate where all voices can be heard, but too often it's just shouting at or across each other. The work that we do now is about trying to listen and learn and live together across difference and build up community together across those differences. And I would say our foremost project for that is called Evolve, Groundbreaking Jewish Conversations, which are founded on the principle of civil discourse. Another thing that the classical Reconstructionists did was to raise up democracy itself as a religious principle, out of this understanding that a robust enactment of the commitments of democracy were the strongest protection against anti-Semitism and other persecutions. This understanding that that democratic commitments most fully enacted would be good for all minorities, for sure, and for all of America to live up to its ideals of expansive civic nationalism rather than a narrow racialized nationalism. So one of the things that they did was to talk about, sometimes they would use the language of mitzvah for voting, an obligation, a commandment even. And they would do this for Jews, for sure, that's coded language for Jews, but they were also talking about that obligation for all people, that it was incredibly important. And they brought that to life with an amazing book that they published in the 50s called The Faith of America, that was co-authored with a Methodist minister, where they aimed to develop suitable, I'm quoting here, suitable liturgies for the observance of democratic holidays in the spirit of reverence, rituals, and liturgies which more explicitly articulate the religious implications of democracy. So I'm just going to read very, very briefly from this classical text and end with a contemporary expression. As I said, the goal here, when they talk about what they're trying to do, is to help folks from all religious lives and all groups to meet on common ground through the enactment of democratic commitments like voting. And when they talk about, so it's organized around the secular holidays of America, including Election Day. And when they talk about Election Day, they describe it as a day devoted to the responsibilities of self-government. The exercise of suffrage is both a sacred right and a solemn responsibility. And just to read very selectively from their introduction, of talking, we would call it maybe a kavanah on the significance of this day. On this day, when we cast our vote for those who are to make our laws and to direct their execution, we seek thy guidance, O God. This day, the destiny of the nation lies in the hands of us, its citizens. Thou hast charged us with the responsibility to direct that destiny according to thy will. May the integrity, justice, and beneficence of our government confirm our faith in thy divine rule. May go on, some of it very resonant, some of it a little bit dated. We have a website now, less a book, more a website called Ritual Well. And when I searched for prayers for voting and prayers for Election Day, I found many, many beautiful examples. I'm going to just read very quickly from two. One from kids from our campers back in 2015, Election Day blessing that begins, "Blessed are you who gives us freedom, justice, and the power to choose our leaders." And I'll end with a prayer for the electorate by David Zvi Kalman. May the one who graces, and this is to be read alongside the prayer for government, ideally on the Shabbat before election. May the one who graces each person with knowledge and teaches humanity understanding, bless and protect the voters of this land on the upcoming election, so that they may place in all their gates leaders of thousands and leaders of hundreds, leaders of 50s and leaders of 10s, people of valor who revere God, people of truth who despise corruption. The one who sustains nations on order, on truth, and on peace, may it be your will that no misfortune occur by their hands, and may the nation rejoice when the righteous abound. Save them from a wicked path and from those who speak perversely. Send wisdom into their heart and make knowledge pleasant to their soul. As it says, then you shall understand virtue and justice, equality and every good path, and may it be your will. Please vote.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Waxman. Our next speaker is Rabbi Hauer, who joined the Orthodox Union as its executive vice president on May 1st, 2020. He stepped into a pretty crazy time to start that role. And in this role, he serves as the organization's rabbinic leader, heading its communal-oriented efforts and serving as its professional, religious, and policy leader and primary spokesman. Rabbi Hauer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Corey. I also echo appreciation expressed by my colleagues to the JCPA and to Melanie and to Kaya for this opportunity for us to appear together to discuss this important matter. The issue of participation in voting, which is something which is a priority for each of us in motivating our community to do so. Every election season, there's actually a very, very modern text that is circulated by us and by others in the Orthodox community. It's a letter which was written in October 1984, and it was written by a man named Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Rabbi Feinstein came to the United States in 1936. He had served as a rabbi in Luban in Russia, and after experiencing increasing pressure from the Soviet regime, he left that country when he had the opportunity and came to New York City. Rabbi Feinstein was an outstanding halachist, Talmudist, who left a legacy of shelves full of outstanding works and whose halachic rulings serve as a significant basis for how we approach halacha today in the modern world. Rabbi Feinstein wrote a letter on October 3rd, 1984, a brief letter. He wrote, "On reaching the shores of the United States, Jews found a safe haven. The rights guaranteed by the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights have allowed us the freedom to practice our religion without interference and to live in this republic in safety. The fundamental principle of Judaism is hakarat hatov, recognizing benefits afforded us and giving expression to our appreciation. Therefore, it is incumbent upon each Jewish citizen to participate in the democratic system which guards the freedom we enjoy. The most fundamental responsibility incumbent on each individual is to register to vote." Beautiful letter makes the rounds every election season and helps encourage the strong participation, which needs continual coaxing within our community. It's a fascinating mandate. Hakarat hatov, appreciation. Rabbi Feinstein was not talking about trying to express appreciation to a particular politician who had done you favors. He was speaking about an expression of appreciation for the opportunity that we have in this land to participate in the electoral process, to have a voice in our governance. He had what to contrast this with. He had run away from the Soviet regime. I have my own little personal anecdote that relates to it, elements of which I'm not particularly proud of. And that is, I actually was born in Canada, and I became a citizen of the United States around 20 years ago, and had a swearing-in ceremony along with hundreds of others, and came to the regularly to occur. I needed to do it. That was my attitude. Okay, I have to make sure I show up to the swearing-in, get the necessary papers. I brought a couple of books to read, some things that I needed to write during the process while waiting. And sitting there, I was sitting next to an older gentleman who was also being sworn in, who had come from China. And as we were sitting there, I noticed that on his sleeve, the edge of the sleeve of his suit, he had a tag that is often sewn on the sleeve of suits that says the name of the manufacturer. He bought a new suit for the occasion. I was coming from Canada to the United States. I didn't appreciate the privilege of living in a country like this, but to Jew. He was coming from China to the United States. For him, it was a moment, a day of celebration, to have that opportunity. That's what Rabbi Feinstein spoke of. If we fail to participate in a country that has given us, in this process, in a country that has given us an opportunity that Jews have not had everywhere we have lived for generations, that Jews still do not have everywhere that they live. That would be a failure to appreciate a special historic opportunity. We as Jews, fundamentally, Yehudim, must express hoda'ah, must be appreciative, grab the opportunities which we are granted. There's a second stage, of course, and that is for each person to understand the gift of democracy, that everyone has the opportunity to be present. Something which we try to message our voter registration test. There's a beautiful teaching around which is really fresh for us. We speak of Yom Kippur, where Maimonides teaches in the laws of Tshuva. He writes about how the world has a collective innocence, or collective, and that is somehow the mass, all of humanity, that determines together what we do. Maimonides writes, and therefore each person should view themselves, especially in the time of year that we've just gone through, the time of Tshuva, the time of improvement, as if the world is literally on the edge. And the one action that we do will make the literal world of a difference. We can change everything. There's no privilege in voting that goes or that ought to go to the powerful member of the community. Everyone has a vote. Every vote makes a difference. We have learned that lesson in recent history in the United States numerous times, numerous nail-biting experiences that brought that point home. And it's true in life, Jim. It's important that every person always understand that in the balance of goodness and righteousness in the world, the decisions that any single individual makes can make all the difference. The voting opportunity is one where we again bring that point home. That's something that people can appreciate and can express in their action. The prophet Yirmiyahu taught us about seeking the peace of the city in which we reside. Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7. Yirshu et shlom ha'ir. Seek the peace of the place where you reside, and pray for them, because in their peace lies yours. Jeremiah seems to be counseling a sort of enlightened self-interest. Want goodness, peace, good things for your community. It will benefit everybody. Universal goodness to strive for. Commentators like Rashi and Rabbi Yonah of Girona took it even further, speaking of this as a mandate to just seek the well-being of the society around you, a core Jewish value which we all share. It's an exercise of Jewish leadership when we vote conscious of it, vote for value, the goodness, and the values that should affect society as a whole. But I would like to add, importantly, that there's another Jewish value in voting, and one which we, in our efforts within the Orthodox community, also promote, side by side with a concern, a true concern, to advocate for the well-being of the community and the country as a whole. And that is a very important core part of the process, which is advocate for ourselves, to advocate for what we need as a community. We must recall that in our biblical history of advocacy, Jacob and his sons advocated to Pharaoh for a place to live that would allow them to continue to thrive as a distinct community of Jacob, of Israel. We have to remember that when Moses went to Pharaoh to advocate before government, to play a role in the not quite democratic process, which was Egypt, he went there to advocate for freedom for the Jewish people from slavery, for the Jewish interest, for communal interest. When Esther went to Ashira, she advocated. She was playing her role in the democratic process of the time. She was advocating for protection from anti-Semitism, something to protect the Jewish people and the Jewish community particularly. And when Nehemiah went before the king of Persia, he advocated for the state of Israel, which was struggling at that time. We are a community that feel very strongly, the Jewish community, that we need to strengthen ourselves internally as a particular community that nurtures and grows the Jewish God, Jewish commitment of all of our members. And in that sense, we advocate strongly to be able to advocate for our precious state of Israel, which is a piece, a core piece, a gift of Jewish identity that has been granted to the Jewish people in our time to bring together and to give an opportunity for Jewish identity to so many, to advocate for safety, security, our community, and institutions, to advocate for the ability for us to educate our children in our schools, with their support from government. We want to exercise the right to vote. It's a Jewish privilege. It's a privilege we've been granted in this country. We don't want to neglect it. We want to seek the well-being of our country as a whole. We also want to advocate for our own strength as a community. So be strong, continue to be a beacon of the world. Our country. Appreciate the privilege.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Hauer. Just a quick reminder that if anybody has any questions for us, we're going to be having a question and answer session immediately following our next speaker. Please put those questions in the question box and we will make sure we can get to them. Our fourth speaker is Rabbi Konigsburg, who is the Chief Operating Officer at the Rabbinical Assembly. She earned an MA in Talmud and Rabbinics and Rabbinic Ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary. Rabbi Konigsburg, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you, Corey, to Melanie, to Chaya, to JCPA, and it's an honor to learn from my fellow rabbinic panelists. I want to open today with a text from Brachot 55a. Which I think directly addresses the concept of voting and its importance in our tradition. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak ein ma medin parnas al hatzibor ela inken nimlachim batzibor. So Rabbi Yitzchak said, one may only appoint a leader over the community if one consults with the community. And he draws that teaching from a text in Exodus where God says to Moshe to appoint Bitzalel as the chief architect designer of the Mishkan. And the Talmud says, Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu leMoshe, Moshe hagun alecha Bitzalel. God says to Moshe, is Bitzalel an okay choice with you? And Moshe to this responds, Ribono shel olam im lefanecha hagun lefanai lo kol sheken. Moshe says to God, if you're okay with him, how? Of course I'm okay with him. And nevertheless, God replies, Af al pichen lech amor lehem livnei Israel, basically. And so God says to Moshe, even see if it's okay with you, go ahead and you need to also consult with the children of Israel to see if Bitzalel will be an okay choice. And Moshe goes ahead and he does. This is a Talmudic nod to the concept of consent of the governed. This also shows up in the Declaration of Independence, and it's a nice illustration of what it means. So the Declaration of Independence, I'm sure people know, talks about inalienable rights among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And immediately following the next sentence, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That it's a key concept that the people who are going to be ruled by this government need to have the ability to impact and to choose. It's their consent that authorizes the government to be chosen and to be effective. So this concept goes back all the way to the Talmud. It's in the Declaration of Independence, and it's the importance of why everyone who is eligible should go ahead and vote. It's only with our consent, the people who are being ruled by the government in any place, whether it's the people of Israel in the desert on their way between Mitzrayim and Israel, or whether it's those of us here and now in this place and time, it's so important to have your voice heard as part of the democratic process. I was asked to share a little bit about what my organization is doing to encourage people to vote. So we have been partners with the Get Out the Vote effort of the Religious Action Center that Rabbi Pessner mentioned. We're encouraging our members and our synagogues to partner and participate. We're also partnering with the Poor People's Campaign voting effort and the NCJW, the National Council of Jewish Women's voting campaign. We have our own 10 actions people can take. It was set up for the days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But just like Hoshana Rabbah or perhaps Shmini Atzeret are considered the final deadlines for the high holiday season, so too, even if you didn't partake of those suggested actions, you can still do them now. It is not too late. You can take action related to voting now. Also on our website is guidelines for rabbis and communities working for not-for-profit organizations as to what is and isn't allowed under the tax code. I can put that link out also with the notes from today's webinar. We're also partnering with campaigns that call for social media to not to profit from disinformation or from hate speech, and that we've seen is a really increasingly problematic thing that's taking place and something that is very much concerning us. In my 10 years of experience working in public policy, what I've noticed is an increase in the politicization of values. Saying what you stand for now risks being seen as political. I firmly believe that commitment to democracy, to counting every vote, to the peaceful transition of power, they're not partisan ideas, they're American ideals. And it's our role as leaders to stand up for those values and as Jewish leaders to represent Jewish values. We must not let any political party redefine morality. It's our job as Jewish leaders to stand up for what's right.
On behalf of JCPA, I just want to thank all of our speakers for your inspiring, meaningful, and important presentations. And so I'd like to move into some questions that we have. And my first question is, Rabbi Hauer spoke about advocating for Jewish interests, and Rabbi Konigsburg spoke a little bit about the need to avoid some of the reinterpretation of what Jewish interests are and the politicization of that. It is clear that we're facing increased polarization both in our country and within our own Jewish communities, and even more on a micro level, even within our shuls. And so I am sure all of you have faced questions from rabbis in your denominations who are faced with this problem. And so my question for each of you is, how are each of you counseling rabbis and lay leaders on how to internally resolve some of those issues, and how do you see that moving forward in terms of as it increases with this election, and also at the same time recognizing the need for civic engagement within our communities? It's a lot there, sorry.
I mean, I touched on it a little bit in my talk. I want to share a story that was so incredibly powerful to me, and that really guided the creation of the project I mentioned in my remarks, Evolve, which is really designed to kind of foster the development of robust relational conversation, like even covenantal conversation, we sometimes call it, as opposed to just the partisanship and the breaking down and the yelling at each other. I was talking with a layperson about on a very, very divisive topic, and she was giving me incredibly wise counsel. And at the end of it, I said to her, you know, I was afraid to even mention this to you because I thought you would find it so alienating. And she said, Deborah, at the end of the day, I want to create a Jewish community where on Kol Nidre we can all come together and be in community and pray. And it was just that reference to Kol Nidre, which, you know, we just chanted it on Sunday evening, where we begin by saying we are all sinners. We are, every one of us, sinners. Like, so the radical humility and the notion of that we come together, we step away from our certainty and into a place of humility, and we come together to constitute community to do this incredibly essential work. That seems to me the metaphor, the goal that we want to be driving toward, and to develop practices and skills which include not what we've been doing because it isn't working, new ways of talking and new ways of listening and finding ways to maximize the ways that we can act together, that feels really essential for developing new paths toward an abiding and connected civitas that we need in the Jewish community and in the wider world.
All right. Go ahead, Rabbi Hauer.
It's certainly an area of concern that I assume we are all making efforts to teach about and to talk about. Personally, I've done it in the text about Hillel and Shammai that Rabbi Pessner quoted before is certainly a fixture and an important part of it. I would just note something, beyond the political. The issue of our temperament when it comes to arguing politics is unlikely to stay in the realm of the political. A person who doesn't listen to the other side when they're making an argument in the political realm probably doesn't do such a good job either listening to their spouse or listening to their children, listening to their employees. It's a general modality. It's a general world of midot. It's very instructive to note that Maimonides teaches that Pirkei Avot, which, as you know, is the Mishnaic text, which teaches us about interpersonal behavior, was actually placed next to the tractate about the Sanhedrin, about leadership, about judges and courts. And Maimonides said, because if there isn't an ethic in leadership, then there won't be an ethic in the community as a whole. And we could perhaps borrow from that and say that if we're not tolerant and listening and communicating and hearing each other when it comes to politics, we won't do it either when it comes to any other aspect of relationship. So this isn't just a campaign about civility in politics. It's a campaign about midot, about being good people, listening to each other, caring for each other.
Amen. I would build on that if I can jump on Rabbi Hauer's, I think, very insightful and right building on Rabbi Waxman. I think, so tactically, we partnered with the Pardes Institute, which is a wonderful Beit Midrash in Israel, to develop a training for our congregations to engage deeply on the Jewish texts and tradition in Chavruta around dialogue and sacred disagreement. Because of all the things we hear from our congregations, the number one thing we are asked for is not one particular political or social justice issue, but rather how do we maintain ourselves as a pluralistic, inclusive, loving community. And, the Reform movement's very proud of how diverse we are across racial lines and across kind of backgrounds. But an area of critique is sometimes we skew in one direction politically, and we take very seriously amplifying the voices of those who may feel that they are in a political minority because their politics should not preclude them for the sanctity of community. And so training our congregations at how to actually do that work so that, as Rabbi Waxman and Rabbi Hauer implied, as a result of which, despite disagreement, the community is stronger. There is more sanctity. God is dwelling in the space of the dialogue more so than as if we would have, God forbid, pushed God out of the sanctuary because of our way of talking about politics or disagreement. So what's great is Jewish tradition and wisdom, as you just heard from Rabbi Hauer, is replete with insight and wisdom and text around how we do this work.
And to continue to build, what I will also say is that all that is true, and there are certain values that I think are you can't compromise upon them. And so whether that's support for a strong and healthy state of Israel, or whether that's valuing every human life and it's created in the image of God, there are certain things that when those things are called into question, I don't think we're in the question anymore of midot, and I think we're in the question of really what are our fundamental principles and what do we believe. And I feel very strongly that as much as we need to make place for every point of view and every type of person, that people should not be limited from community in those times and places, I also think we need to know what we stand for, and we need to say very loudly that there are certain things that are very important to us. And I think that, 4 years ago, we were also talking about civility and discourse. I think it's very important. We should still. I think that the discourse has changed, and I think that not everything that we're talking about is a matter of civility anymore. And I think we have to be wise enough to know the difference.
Thank you. We have a question for Rabbi Pessner from your friend Jimmy Hawkins. You mentioned in your presentation the origin of the rack. Could you say a little more about the historic relationship between the African American community and the Jewish communities in a commitment to racial justice, and as it relates to, I think he's referring to the Poor People's Campaign. And I want to not just direct that to Rabbi Pessner. I'd like all of you, I think some of you talked about working with other organizations as well, but I'd like all of you to sort of discuss how you view and the role of getting out the vote and civic engagement from your own community, as well as the importance of working with other communities outside of the Jewish world.
I love the question. I really love the question. So first of all, let me just say, though, the 5 screens we're looking at are all white. The Jews of Color Field Building Initiative, and led by the incredible Ilana Kaufman, would tell us that the data show that there's between 12 and 15% of the American Jewish community that is not white, Jews of color in various forms. That means there's something like 1 million people in America that now say that they are Jewish, they identify as Jewish, and they may be Black, Brown, Asian, Latinx, Sephardi, Mizrahi, the whole wonderful, delicious mix. And so, though I personally resonated with Rabbi Hauer's story earlier about kind of from Rav Feinstein, kind of the kind of Ashkenormic myth of how many of us my grandparents came from Russia, they were, of European descent, etc. That isn't the norm anymore in any way. So that kind of old picture of Rabbi Heschel marching with Rabbi King represents a false binary. Racial justice is a Jewish issue because racial justice is a Jewish issue. In our movement, we say Black Lives Matter is a Jewish value, full stop. That is in part because we really believe that there is this 400-year history in the United States of systemic racism that calls Jews to account and to be part of the democracy we live in. And Black and brown Jews are directly impacted by the violence of the racism around us. So for us, I think it's about reaching across lines of difference, whether it's partnering with the Poor People's Campaign, as Rabbi Konigsburg mentioned, led by Reverend William Barber. And just yesterday, we had a big mobilization in Washington with Reverend Barber, or working with the NAACP. I sit on the board, the national board of the NAACP. My board seat traces itself to Kivi Kaplan and beyond. So there is the kind of, partnering on the ground with historically Black churches or Latino Catholic parishes, because that's part of being in a multiracial democracy. But it also means saying we have to hear the voices of Jews of color in our movements and in our congregations, to whom we need to step back and allow to lead, this call notwithstanding.
Did any of you all wanted to tag in on in terms of the work you're doing with other organizations? I wanted to just open it up so that
Corey, can I just say one of these? I'm sorry, it also asked the question, to what extent should we be looking at civic engagement through a racial justice lens because of the racial reckoning we're going through in our country? Whether it's the COVID pandemic, which has revealed the kind of radical inequalities of our healthcare system, or the voter suppression, or of course, George Floyd and many others. The 5 of us might disagree on how to look at civic engagement and elections through a racial justice lens, but I think we'd be abdicating our responsibility if we didn't ask the question, particularly since so much of I talked about the Voting Rights Act earlier. One federal judge who analyzed one particular state's voter suppression tactic in North Carolina called it racist with surgical precision. And last night well, I'll leave it at that, but we need to talk about race in the election.
I think that's right. I mean, here in Louisville, Kentucky, the Jewish community has been, my rabbis mentioned, Breonna Taylor is all over the news here, and the injustice that was involved in her killing has resonated throughout the Jewish community here in Louisville. And so absolutely, I think that's important to lift that up. Rabbi Hauer, it looks like you may be muted.
Thank you. Yes, I would add that those concerns are shared concerns, I think, across the board and across the community. The level of leadership which Rabbi Pessner and the RAC have demonstrated, and is not something that we have suitably followed, to date in this point. But we are certainly as well engaged both in principle, in terms of the universal concern which we must have, certainly for the communities of color and the discrimination which they face in our country, something which has come so painfully to light in these days, and as well in not speaking theoretically, but in outreach to leaders in other parts of the faith community, to show partnership and to show care, and salute your work.
Absolutely. And to build, it's not only for getting out the vote and for the election, it's also for making change now and after as well. Like, these partnerships are important across the board. If systemic change is going to happen, it's going to take a lot of us, all of us, as many as we can, to work towards it. And that means partnership and building relationships across many, many lines of difference.
I mean, I just want to, there's not that much to add. I think that my colleagues have really articulated very, very powerfully. I think that this election season kind of concentrates the focus on this right now. But I think entering into partnership, into relationship, and it's about also part of the process is also helping people to understand that we build coalitions with people around the things that we agree with, even as there's maybe things that we don't agree with, and that it is through coalition work that we can achieve the kind of structural changes that Rabbi Konigsburg was just talking about. That feels really important too, and to be in it for the long haul. For sure, there's a degree of self-interest, and then also out of the recognition that that this is good. That what is good for the world is good for the Jews. That the self-interest transcends, and that we are transformed by our commitment, by allying ourselves with other people. That our redemption is bound up in theirs, and that we are going to be changed by our struggle for their redemption. So helping people to gain capacity to do that kind of work for the long haul, and to make certain that we come in acutely listening, and not taking over, and not making certain that we not avoiding paternalism, avoiding really proving ourselves to be good and reliable and thoughtful and engaged partners in it for the long haul.
I think that is a note to end on. And I want to thank all of you. I mean, I wish we had another 2 hours to have this discussion. This has been truly wonderful, and I know everyone watching is appreciating it as well. And I've truly appreciated it. And so to our viewers, we want to thank you so much for joining our program today. We hope you enjoy our programming, and if you have enjoyed it, please consider making a donation to JCPA by visiting our website at jewishpublicaffairs.org and clicking on donate. I do hope that all of you, that if you take one thing away from this program, is to make sure that you are registered to vote, that you go out to vote, you develop a plan to vote, how you will vote, and that you support your family and friends to understand how their vote will count, that it's important, and that every single person and one of us must work together to ensure our strong democracy. Again, thank you all so much, Rabbi Pessner, Rabbi Waxman, Rabbi Konigsburg, Rabbi Hauer. We truly appreciate your time, and to all our viewers, thank you so very much.